for me, once people start saying, we have to fight racism, I'm an anti-racist, I'm always slightly suspicious of people that phrase missions in that way, because it sort of goes without saying. I mean, you don't have schools declaring that they're going to fight paedophilia. Exactly. Yes. That they're committed to ending, trafficking and slavery. I mean, obviously, if such a thing was going on in the school, they would have a duty to deal with it.
Of course.
And if it were criminal, report it. You don't really need to state it as a missive. So one wonders, perhaps, we've talked about this a lot on this programme, such as the number of programmes we've had. We haven't had too many, but in previous programmes I've talked with people like Claire Fox about the third sector, and she's also described a kind of moral disorientation across the public sector, which she suggested was one of the reasons that these third sector groups, with their own agendas and their own partisan view of the world, have been able to move in quite adeptly and, if you like, promote a narrative in schools that, it's one of many narratives. It's one way of looking at the world. If we say, for example, critical race theory is the idea that there is an inherent conflict between people of colour and white people, if you accept those categories. I personally don't. That's a very Marxist way of seeing the world, where there's a perpetual class struggle, and it can only be resolved through violent revolution and creation of a proletariat state. So that's one political view of the world, certainly not the view of the world.
No.
So do you think these third sector groups are activists who simply see that moral disorientation of the organisation, of the school, of the idea of education? There's been a kind of abandonment of the notion of a liberal humanist education, and in sweeps somebody who's got a very different idea of what they want children to learn, and the field is clear.
I think that's absolutely right, and intellectually the ground has been prepared for them by the kind of prior devaluation of the standards of knowledge, and the kind of knowledge differentiations. So, it is, when you have, for example, lessons in RE that are asking children to make their own version of a Bible by doing a fashion Bible, you can you don't need to be a theologian or an archbishop to see that something's really gone wrong here, because they're confusing like the knowledge that you find in the Daily Mirror or the Sun or the Telegraph or the Guardian, that is the public sphere, with disciplinary knowledge that would belong to religious education.
Yes.
And they have very different, it's not like one is good, one is bad, one is true, one is lies. It's that each sphere has different standards of truth criteria, and all of us are kind of spontaneously familiar with the everyday life and everyday knowledge. But it is a job of education to introduce people, younger people, to the more unfamiliar and more difficult standards and networks of meaning, if you like, that, are involved in learning a disciplinary subject. So, you can see, and all the pressures in education have been to make education and the syllabus and the curriculum relevant, to make it accessible, to make it so everybody succeeds. And it's basically an abandonment of disciplinary standards, and so that ground has been prepared. And as you say, the moral disorientation that has come to the fore is the kind of final push at the door that is allowing third party, nobody has any scrutiny of these people.
Well, that's it.
Nobody has any scrutiny.
That's something that the Bad Law Project's really interested in, and we've got our own project within the Bad Law Project called Bad Education. And I think, we've spent a lot of time discussing what we think bad education is, what makes bad education. And we think it's very much a legal question. We have very good laws in this country. Good, and I don't want to talk about the Equality Act because we haven't got 6 years to do that. But the Equality Act, in my view, has some responsibility for the way policies are being drafted that in a way can cave to the demands of very partisan activist groups. But I don't want to talk about that now. But if we look at the Education Act, which is a much simpler affair, it does clearly state that schools cannot be promoting partisan, one-sided views, particularly of public contested issues, political issues, that they have a duty under the Education Act to promote balance, a balance of ideas. And I know that DDU is you're drafting a petition as we speak, which you might want to say something about, in relation to what you call indoctrination,
Yes.
which would seem to be a legal abdication by schools of their duty under the Education Act not to indoctrinate. That's basically what the Education Act is saying. You can't indoctrinate. So
right.
how do you how do you define indoctrination? And maybe it would be very interesting for our viewers to hear your thoughts on why it's even prohibited in the law in the first place. Why do we have that clause in the Education Act that says balance is really important? What were they aiming?
Yeah.
What were they aiming to do with that, and why were they aiming to do it?
Well, I mean, I don't know the specific reasoning behind the Education Act, but in terms of educational, philosophical and sociological discussions, the notion of impartiality is really, really important, and it has quite a specific meaning within education. And it's not one that's very well understood.
Could you tell us how it's understood by educators?
Yeah. It's to do with impartiality. It's to do with something I mentioned earlier, which is the idea of objectivity. Right? It's the idea that it is possible to create a discursive space where you are able to acknowledge the reasoning behind a series of views, including those you disagree with. Now, that's not relativism. It doesn't mean you then think, oh, because I've acknowledged them, understood them, they're all okay. You then have to make a judgment. But the point about education is that as you proceed through it, you are able to make more accurate judgments as you just become more familiar with the kinds of claims there. So it's not really, and often impartiality is understood as more narrowly political impartiality. That's not quite right in education, right? Because, it's not like that isn't really happening. Well, it is happening in some schools. A lot of teachers, particularly in certain areas of London and metropolitan areas, are very openly, for example, anti-conservative and make no attempt to hide that from their children, from their pupils.
For sure.
It's one thing to do that in a politics discussion with 16, 17-year-olds, but I don't think it's legitimate to do with 10-year-olds in a classroom. No. But the more broader understanding and meaning of impartiality, let me give you a concrete example. And this is from a school that a teacher sent in. So one of the tasks, they were discussing the toppling of statues, and one of the tasks the children were set was for homework after the class discussion was to look at questions like, well, Edward Colston's gone, what alternative person would you have in its place? Discuss. And that was it, right? And that might seem like balanced in a way, but it actually isn't, because what that is doing is sweeping off the board. It's not even acknowledging the fact that there is a huge swathe of legitimate public opinion that didn't think statues should be toppled in the first place. So it was assumed that the toppling of statues is de facto a good thing.
Criminal damage for one thing, but yeah.
Well, that didn't come into it, right? It was, you could say there is a legal... You don't necessarily even have to do that in the class, as long as you acknowledge there is a question of legality here that we could look at another time. But none of that, right? It is just de facto assumed. So, and, we have now a major example, the AQA, that is officially saying it's going to bring an EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion frame to its specifications for GCSEs, and I think with A levels have probably already done it. Now that is, and on the surface, a very superficial reading, it seems like, extend the range of authors. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that the very concept of EDI as currently understood in society is a politically partisan concept with a whole load of assumptions about what the majority of who happen to be white are like and what the minorities who happen to be non-white are like.